evening, everybody. Nice to see you all here this evening for the second of our series of gender studies lectures this fall. The Gender Studies lecture series is being presented by the Gender Studies program. If you're interested in gender studies, you too can be a gender studies minor. Just ask me how. The series of speeches or talks this year is presented by members of the faculty here at Westmont College who teach as part of the Gender Studies program. And tonight we're very privileged to hear from Dr. Meredith Whitnah in the sociology department. Dr. Whitnah just joined Westmont in January of this past year, so she's not even been here a full year yet. So you're really getting in on the beginning of a wondrous career here at Westmont College for Dr. Whitnah. Dr. Whitnah came to us from Notre Dame, where she did her Ph.D. in sociology, finishing up in almost exactly a year ago, in 2015. Her research is on faith, gender, and South Africa. She got her start in her interest in South Africa traveling there as an undergraduate. And so this is something that perhaps you can take into consideration as you're thinking about study abroad programs while you're a student. It may lead to years and years and years of school because you can find out all sorts of exciting and interesting things about a country when you're traveling. Dr. Whitnah was able to intern at a women's center in South Africa while she was an undergraduate. And that opened the door to a new area of interest and research for her that led to a PhD program. Her talk this evening is titled Faith and the Fragility of Justice, Religious Responses to Gender-Based Violence in South Africa. We'll have two responses after her talk, one from Dr. Helen Rhee in the Religious Studies Department, and one from Dr. Deborah Dunn in the Communication Studies Department. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Whitnah.
Well, thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and I have to apologize in advance. I'm fighting a cold, and it's my first cold in several years, so the timing is not ideal, so bear with me and the coughing. So thanks so much. This talk is coming from a book project that I'm working on that's titled Faith and the Fragility of Justice, Religious Responses to Gender-Based Violence in South Africa. In June of 1985, church leaders in South Africa convened at the annual national conference of the South African Council of Churches. The conference took place at a time of growing unrest in townships, increasing state repression, and unprecedented violence under apartheid. Apartheid was a system of racial segregation that had been in place since 1948, and there had been various waves of protest against it. This 1985 National Church Conference took place in the middle of what some have called a third wave, and actually it would be the final wave, of repression and resistance that had begun in the late 1970s and would end with the transition to democracy in the early 1990s. And that transition included the release of Nelson Mandela from prison and the unbanning of the African National Congress. Democratic elections would then finally first be held in 1994. So the 1980s were marked by increased local resistance to apartheid, and the government responded with increasingly repressive tactics, as sectors of the liberation movement also adopted more violent forms of resistance. The escalating turmoil in 1985 did not just prefigure apartheid's end, it also echoed previous political violence. In fact, on March 21st, 1985, a police shooting of people attending a funeral occurred on the 25th anniversary of police violence at a peaceful protest in Sharpeville, which had first brought international attention to the violence of apartheid in 1960. So, given this tumultuous context, it is unsurprising that the South African Council of Churches special issue report on their June 1985 National Conference conveyed a sense of urgency. This newsletter reported that the General Secretary of the SACC, Beyers Naudé, had called for the church to embark on a campaign of civil disobedience, and that church leaders met behind closed doors to consider whether they would confront President P.W. Botha more directly. The newsletter describes the conference as an echo of the state of affairs in the country. The situation was portrayed as an historical watershed that would push the churches to respond. And in fact, the Kairos document was published in September of that year. Written primarily by Black church leaders, whose names were never officially released, the Kairos document made a prophetic critique of the theological and biblical justifications of apartheid, as well as critiquing inaction against it. It called on churches to recognize that there is a Christian mandate to work against injustice. So this particular conference in 1985, in June of 1985, occurred at a crucial moment in the social, political, and religious landscape of South African history. And it was an event that signaled growing agitation for strong religious protests against the apartheid government. But there was an important subplot to this event. The original conference theme was Women, a Power for Change. The original intention of the conference had been to highlight the significant role that women could play in society and to call for their participation in the struggle against apartheid. But, as the newsletter put it, while the theme of the conference was Women, a Power for Change, and it was intended that the conference would devote a good deal of its time to this issue, events from outside overruled, and the agenda was radically changed to deal with life and death issues. If we fast forward to the democratic context, we see that today, South Africa has one of the highest reported rates of gender-based violence in the world, and especially of intimate partner homicide and rape. It was dubbed the rape capital of the world by a variety of news sources in 1999, 5 years after the first democratic elections of 1994, and 2 years after the country's constitution was ratified, a constitution which has been hailed as one of the most progressive in the world, especially for its explicit inclusion of women's rights and a quota system for women's political representation. Yet the country continues to make international news headlines with stories about gender-based violence. As recently as 2012, there were reports of the gang rape of a 17-year-old mentally disabled girl. Such occurrences are not uncommon, but this one was video recorded, and the video was circulated on the internet to widespread public outcry. And this particular incident made the news cycle 5 days before I got on a plane to South Africa to begin this project, on how faith-based NGOs like the South African Council of Churches that had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement have addressed gender-based violence, which is an issue that largely emerged in public awareness in the democratic context and appears to have increased in severity over time. This particular story of the gang rape of the mentally disabled girl was still reverberating when I was there, and it prompted one woman I interviewed to ask me regarding the widespread public outcry about the incident. She said, "Was the church? Did you hear the church's prophetic voice in the public domain?" I thought for half a second and said, "Well, no, at least not in the public domain." She responded, "That's my problem." And then she proceeded to critique the lack of a prophetic voice from the church about gender, violence, and other social issues in the democratic context. So I am proposing that there is a connection between the story of the South African Council of Churches conference theme on women in 1985 and this particular woman's observation about the church's lack of prophetic voice around gender-based violence. Why were groups like the SACC engaged in cultivating a prophetic voice against the injustice and violence of apartheid, yet have faltered when it comes to speaking and acting with as much conviction around gender-based violence? And the SACC is only one case. I studied 2 other groups, at least one of which has been outspoken in calling for the church and society to respond to gender-based violence and in developing programs to address it. Yet the SACC has not, nor has the third organization I study. So what explains the different responses to gender-based violence among these groups that had recognized the injustice and violence of apartheid? One reasonable answer to these questions is to point to structural factors and changes, including things like the organization's internal structures, their constituencies, their dependence on financial resources, and their connection to the government and political structures, all of which also changed dramatically with the transition to democracy in 1994. These factors are certainly important, but they do not provide a full explanation. We need to also examine the content of the cultural discourse that the organizations were cultivating about the injustice and violence of apartheid. Put simply, it is not a coincidence that the SACC was talking about women, a power for change, as distinct from the life and death issues of 1985 and their subsequent faltering attempts to address gender-based violence in the democracy. So here's the crux of my argument. These organizations cultivated distinct theological cultures, constellations of ideas and beliefs, that involve particular ways of understanding a religious mandate to work for social justice. These theological cultures then crystallize into what I call routinized patterns of discourse. By that I mean, while the ideas do adapt and change over time, they also develop into particular patterns that are always dependent on their original content. Substantively, the most important point is that the organizations varied in how they conceived of gender as a category of justice during apartheid. This difference in their theological cultures has both facilitated and constrained their discursive and practical responses to gender-based violence in the democracy. So what I'm going to do now is take each organization and give examples of their initial theological cultures, how they include and exclude gender, and then show how this matters for their responses to gender-based violence. So we'll begin with the South African Council of Churches, with which you're already familiar. It's the oldest of the three organizations, and it was the most prominent in the anti-apartheid movement. Leaders of the SACC were involved in developing contextual theology, cultivating their own version of liberation and Black theology in the South African context. The SACC's theological culture centers on the idea of liberation. The focus on liberation was rooted in the conviction that God is on the side of the oppressed, that Jesus came to preach freedom, that the church must be an agent of liberation, and this path often involves suffering. For instance, Desmond Tutu, who was General Secretary of the SACC in the late 1970s and early 80s, asserted that this was the good news Jesus came to proclaim, that God was the liberator, the one who set free the oppressed and the poor and exploited. In this theological culture, fighting for justice meant fighting for liberation from the oppressive apartheid system. This focus on liberation directly impacted the SACC's approach to gender. Women were perceived to also be oppressed and in need of liberation, but usually in order to participate in the struggle against apartheid. So for instance, while the focus of the 1985 conference I mentioned at the beginning changed, they did also devote some attention to discussing what exactly it meant that women can be a power for change. And the newsletter put it this way: Jesus still speaks to women through the gospel today, liberating them from the burdens of tradition, customs, and stereotyped habits which oppress them and prevent them from being a power for change. If women realize and accept this challenge, they cannot but come forth self-confident, self-reliant, and with a fresh understanding of their worth as persons, and therefore changed, capable of bringing about change. This shows a tension that exists throughout the SACC documents. On the one hand, there was a recognition that women, too, needed to be liberated from oppression. On the other hand, these were calls for women's liberation in order for them to facilitate the broader struggle. In addition, where it did exist, the emphasis on women's own liberation tended to be segmented organizationally in a women's division. That division cultivated pointed critiques of the organization's lack of response to gender, the need to dismantle patriarchy as well as apartheid, and the complicity of the church in perpetuating gender oppression. But by and large, this gender critique was segmented within this division. And this is at least in part due to the limitations of this liberation theological culture. People tended to perceive that only one system of oppression could be liberated at one time, echoing the trend within the liberation movement in South Africa more generally, and indeed this is a trend that scholars have observed across the globe. So how has this mattered for their responses to gender-based violence in the democratic context? First of all, more generally, with the transition to democracy, the SACC's theological culture shifted from focusing on how to achieve liberation to, first, concerns that with democracy, liberation had actually not been fully achieved, and second, proposals that enshrining human rights in the Constitution and everyday life was the way to achieve and enact full liberation. In that context, gender-based violence emerged in the SACC's discourse in the transitionary and democratic context as an issue that symbolized a sense of regret for not fully attending to gender issues during apartheid, and as a sign that the liberation achieved with the transition to democracy remained incomplete. For instance, a 2003 report included the assertion that, like many other countries, we have not allowed women to take their rightful place in the church and in society. And the very next sentences are, we are experiencing disgraceful levels of women abuse. Although women are the majority in our society and in the church, they are excluded from effectively benefiting from democracy and excluded from decision-making processes and structures. So gender-based violence is depicted here and elsewhere in their documents as a symptom of the practical lack of equality and rights for women and concern that the liberation that they had fought for was incomplete. So I'm arguing that this is a continuation of the cultural discursive work they had done during apartheid. Framing the struggle as one of liberation, the theological culture adapts to focus on democracy and rights, but the tension that had existed between being concerned with women's liberation and also segmenting it results in this particular response to gender-based violence. These discursive patterns around gender-based violence, as an issue of women's human rights and as something that indicates the fragility of the democracy, then impact their programmatic actions. They run workshops, organize marches, present talks and dramas, and these activities emerge especially within the context of their broader human rights programs, not a gender-specific program. Now, there are some organizational reasons for this. For instance, funding was tight. The organization distributed more work to provincial offices, and an important staff member who had done a lot of the gender work moved into a government position in the democratic context. But my point is that beyond these factors, the apartheid-era theological culture of liberation and the ways in which this theological culture put women's liberation in tension with the broader liberation movement had consequences for the way that gender justice could be pursued in the democracy. Gender-based violence emerged as an issue that highlighted the cost of not paying attention to gendered social relations in the past, and its placement in a broader human rights agenda is a continuation of the theological culture that had been established during apartheid. Next, we move to African enterprise. African enterprise's theological culture centers on racial reconciliation. Rooted in a vision of transformed individual relationships, their approach is the most constrained of the three regarding gender. AE is an evangelistic organization, and it was less overtly involved in the political context than the SACC during apartheid. Practical constraints as a multiracial evangelistic team and founder Michael Cassidy's experience of political activism while a student in the UK propelled them to see their work of evangelism as having a social dimension. They were also influenced by a growing sense within global evangelical circles of the need to prioritize social action in tandem with evangelism. AE's theological culture of reconciliation condemned apartheid as problematic because its racial divisions perpetuated unhealthy relationships. The way forward was to promote reconciliation and understanding among individual people, and this in turn would affect a changed society. So we see this, for instance, in the following depiction of what social life ought to be like. The Lord wants societies living in stability, peace, order, political justice, and equity of economic life and opportunity. This is really the Old Testament picture of shalom, which was not to exist simply as an individual state of inner calm and soundness of being in every way, but as an expression of his right relationships with other individuals around him and between his group and other groups. At its heart are right relationships. In this understanding of how society is to be ordered, apartheid was the antithesis of the right relationships that are supposed to exist between people. But while political justice and economic opportunities are mentioned here, and this quote occurs in a broader context and discussion of race relations, this is also a representative example of the ways in which gender hardly ever appears as a category for social engagement in AE's theological culture of reconciliation. Stories about women are presented in ways that reflect AE's emphasis on individual level transformation, and women are sometimes portrayed in terms of their place in the family, their support of mission work, or their own stories of conversion. But these stories of women's experiences have not translated into broad attention to gender. Gender itself is sublimated and most often completely absent from the public discourse. Consider this statement from the founder in a newsletter piece. Our age is basically one of deep alienations at almost every level, whether interpersonal, marital, denominational, racial, tribal, class, or whatever. How critical, therefore, to remind ourselves that the kingdom of God is the kingdom of right relationships. This portrayal of deep alienations recognizes other social forms of alienation, but falls short of explicitly naming gender. How does this matter for how they respond to gender-based violence? As with the SACC, so with AE, we see the theological culture adapting with the new democratic context, which impacts how they respond to the emergence of gender-based violence as an issue in public awareness at that time. With a continued call for conversion and right relationships, they also have a growing concern with moral decay. In that context, rape and violence against women often appear in lists of other issues that are problematic in South Africa, where they are decrying the decline of morals, especially related to sex and sexuality. This occurs in the context of their concern that democracy is perhaps unintentionally ushering in other social ills. Where the SACC was concerned that liberation had not been fully achieved, AE has focused on decaying morality, and personal, intimate relationships are at the heart of that decay. Reflecting this theological culture of reconciliation and individual relationships, people I interviewed there would sometimes voluntarily bring up gender-based violence as evidence of the power of the gospel for transforming individual lives. So for instance, a younger Black man said, "It's in their testimonies everywhere, where women would actually come and be touched with the message and convert then and there. And when they go home in the midst of all the domestic violence, they live out the Christian life, and their husbands all of a sudden see them praying. And it just, turns off the logic of the man." That phrasing, the logic of the man, is a little awkward. But what he's saying is that domestic violence itself can be changed by an individual woman coming to Christ. Her modeling of faith can change her husband's violent ways. This fits squarely within AE's theological culture that emphasized individual-level reconciliation as the response to apartheid's injustice. But there is a disconnect here in terms of perceiving a social dimension to gender-based violence that could be connected to gender justice. AE's original theological culture did not include a recognition of gender inequality, and this explains their portrayal of gender-based violence as an issue of sex, culture, and moral decay, but not of gender justice. Gender-based violence is not understood in a social systemic way that attends to dynamics of power and inequality in relationships, because gender has not been perceived as a category of unequal relationships in the same way that race was. Thus, perhaps this will not be surprising to you, AE has devoted no programmatic attention to gender-based violence. Now, this is partly due to their organizational structure, multiple leadership changes, increased social conservatism, financial difficulties, programmatic attention to other issues, etc. But beyond this, we see a similar pattern with AE to what sociologist Paul Lichterman describes in his analysis of religious organizations' attempts to enact social change. If an issue, and here we're talking about gender justice generally, is not discursively on the table, action does not happen. Gender-based violence is an issue that can be addressed as a result of the work they are already doing as they preach the gospel, but this does not involve explicit programmatic attention and action. So we'll close with the Peter Maritzburg Agency for Christian Social Awareness. The original intent of the founders of PAXA was to catalyze white Christians' awareness of the evils of apartheid. Their emphasis was on exposing information about the violent and oppressive conditions of people in local communities and working with community members to bring an incisive Christian analysis to the situation. Their theological culture focused on transformation, including both relational encounters and calls for structural change. For instance, their March 1980 newsletter included this statement: "The sinful powers that bind and oppress people, laws and systems that do not protect and conserve, but destroy, barriers that prevent or frighten people from loving and sharing, these are all too real. And we are involved, usually as somewhat unwilling and seemingly helpless participants. But beyond our powerlessness is a greater power that can break all bonds and barriers, even that of death. There is a source of renewal and recreation that is working through all things. Christians know through the resurrection of Jesus that they can share in this transformation." In this theological culture, which combines personal encounters with society-wide oppression and liberation, the relevance of the Christian narrative of Jesus' conquering of death has direct implications for the transformation of society. Pax's theological culture that emphasized transformation also included explicit statements about gender as an equally important dimension of society that needed to be transformed. For instance, the June 1985 newsletter included this statement: "The liberation of men and women from their stereotyped roles and the liberation of oppressed and oppressor, politically, socially, and economically, cannot be separated. They are of equal importance." From this point on, the organization adapted their apartheid-era theological culture of transformation to a wide range of gender issues. Like the SACC, this inclusion of gender has taken different organizational forms, including a gender desk, and Paxa eventually adopted an approach of mainstreaming gender, with the intent of weaving gender analysis in all of their programs. So how does this relate to their responses to gender-based violence in the democracy? As with the other organizations, the way the theological culture develops in the democratic context more generally is important. For Paxa, we see a continued emphasis on the need for social transformation. And in fact, of the three organizations, their original theological culture is the most flexible and adaptable. Democracy is seen to have ushered in only a partial transformation of relationships and structures. And at least in the first decade of the democracy, Paxa calls on the church to continue to work for social transformation. Gender-based violence is seen to stem from gender inequality, and the solution is to continue to push for widespread social transformation. This initial concern develops into an increasingly sharp and pointed critique of the church's inattention to the problem. And this is where we get to the provocative image that we used for the flyer for this talk, which I'm sure is why you're all here. This drawing was done by a local artist in KwaZulu-Natal, where Paxa is located. It was included on the front page of Paxa's Easter 2001 newsletter, and corresponding to the image is a piece by a Catholic nun who has written on gender, violence, and religion. In the piece, she critiques the church's complicity in perpetuating gender inequality and violence, and then she calls for the church to be as involved in the fight against gender inequality, evidenced by the high rates of gender-based violence, as it had been against apartheid. She writes this: "Women were at the cross with Jesus, and women are being crucified today by rape, physical, psychological, and spiritual violence. Stretched between their hopes for a better life and the pain inflicted on them, often by someone they know and profess to love, their bodies and spirits are torn in a violent crucifixion. The women at the cross went home, and in a few days their lives were transformed by the news that Jesus is risen. What transformation awaits women who are battered and bruised, violated and rejected?" There's a lot we could say about this, but this is what I want to highlight. This is a resounding and provocative echo of the discourse and even the imagery that had characterized Paxa's anti-apartheid message and work. Paxa's theological culture under apartheid, with its emphasis on transformation, involved calls for Christian attention to apartheid, breaking silence, and actively naming the social injustices and violence that were being perpetrated. As with the violence of apartheid, so with gender-based violence, Paxa is asking questions like, in the face of death, both hidden and public, where is life to be found? And where is God to be found in this suffering? For both forms of violence and oppression, the person of Jesus and the Easter narrative are crucial. For both, silence needs to be broken. For both, the violence that Jesus experienced resonates with the lives of everyday ordinary people. And for both, the church needs to see these systemic issues as fundamental to the working out of its transformative mission in society. So it's perhaps not surprising that PAXA developed multiple programs to address gender-based violence. Their efforts have ranged from dissemination of research and published journals to practical workshops. Over time, these practical concerns have also resulted in research on the intersection of gender-based violence, HIV/AIDS, and poverty. They develop programs based on this research to bring people from the local community together to try to eradicate gender-based violence. And their work with men in particular has been central, especially in more recent years. Part of this is because they've been able to secure funding, especially from international donors for these projects. And organizationally, they have had well-positioned women in leadership and been more locally focused and committed to community organizations. But these programmatic actions would not be possible without the content of their theological culture. They recognize gender-based violence as a violation of human dignity that was rooted in cultural and systemic gender oppression and in need of transformation. This way of addressing gender and gender-based violence was not always consistent. The process was sometimes contentious, and the voices within PAXA's discourse are multiple. But their sense of the importance of attending to gender as an equally significant system of oppression that needed to be transformed under apartheid meant that their later discourse and strategies for addressing gender-based violence also included a strong condemnation of patriarchal norms and practices that undergirded and perpetuated that violence as an equally egregious form of oppression to the racial violence and injustice of apartheid. This was neither easy nor inevitable, but as with the other two organizations, the content of their theological culture has had remarkable power over time. So let me conclude with a few thoughts about the implications of this, and then I'll look forward to hearing comments and questions. So first of all, for the sake of time, I really have downplayed the importance of structural and organizational factors. So I just want to say that all of this is happening in a social and political context that really does make a difference. So for instance, PAXA's ability to get funding from international donors to fund their research has also meant that in the last few years, they have not only succeeded in surviving, they have also secularized. And within the organization, people are starting to critique the mainstreaming of gender approach, wondering if the prophetic edge of their gender critique is now getting too subsumed in other programs. AE's increasing conservatism and leadership upheavals combined with internal racial dynamics has meant that gender continues to remain an untroubled part of the social order that they're working to maintain. And the movement of important figures from the SACC into the government and focusing of work in provincial offices definitely meant that they lost part of their most prophetic critique around gender, and these things matter. But my point is that taken by themselves, they cannot fully account for the different responses that we see in their responses to gender-based violence. We have to look at these historically contingent and powerful theological cultures to understand what's going on. Second, I want to consider what this story about South Africa can tell us more generally about the contingency of religion's capacity to promote injustice and violence, or justice and peace. And to do that, I'm going to return to the stories that I told at the beginning. The events of 1985 in South Africa were indeed life and death issues. Police were killing people as they attended funerals. Apartheid was violent and repressive. And these were not, and do not continue to be, the only instances of life and death matters. The question is, what allows us to recognize different forms of social inequality and violence, and what do we do about it? My argument is placing theological cultures at the heart of the answer to this question. One of the implications of this argument is that what we imagine to be possible, our vision of and for true justice, and whether or not it includes a recognition of different dimensions of social justice, has to be articulated organizationally, institutionally, in order for it to impact our actions. And finally, I want to return to the woman I mentioned earlier who talked about the lack of a prophetic voice from the church regarding gender-based violence. Later in the interview, she said this. The prophetic voice, unfortunately, is often only triggered in the face of suffering. But the suffering is happening as we speak. Do not wait for a disabled young woman to be raped, because they are being raped as we speak. The prophetic voice of the church, of all people, they should be the voice of those people. I think we come to the same point all the time. The prophetic voice should not be caught off guard. What this woman points us to consider is how we, too, are embroiled in the quest for justice, and what it takes to cultivate a prophetic voice against injustice and violence. There is a cost to all of us when certain issues are allowed to remain hidden and we do not address root causes and legacies of oppression. What alternatives exist that could prompt social engagement of these and similar issues that tend to be hidden before they are so egregious that they command attention and outcry, and not just in South Africa, but in our own communities? These organizations show us that efforts to address injustice and violence are fragile. Yet theological cultures can contain possibilities for crafting responses to the needs of our broken world with the fragile and necessary hope that violence and injustice can be transformed. Gender justice remains an elusive goal, as indeed do racial and economic justice. But these organizations show us that there are social and cultural processes that allow people, some of whom are in these very organizations, and some of whom are sitting in this room, to challenge the systems and norms that perpetuate injustice and violence. We would do well, I think, to listen to these voices and to attend to their calls, fragile as they are, for justice.